On March 6, 1944, at an altitude of 28,000 feet above Brandenburg, Germany, Major Hans Kug felt the oxygen mask freeze to his face. He scanned the clear sky through the canopy of his Messerschmitt Bf 109 G6. He was leading his mixed formation of fighters toward a bomber stream. His ground controllers had assured him that there would be no escort at this altitude, deep in the Reich. Suddenly, a warning crackled through his headset. Panic surged as he realized American single-engine fighters were now here, over Brandenburg. This was less than 50 miles from Berlin. It seemed impossible. No Allied single-engine fighter should have the range to fly this far into Germany and make it back to England. The maximum escort range of the American P-47 Thunderbolt barely reached German airspace. The twin-engine P-38 Lightning could reach Hanover on a good day, but Brandenburg? That was another story altogether. This development shattered every calculation and every defensive strategy the Luftwaffe had relied upon since the daylight bombing campaign began. As Kogler watched the gleaming silver shapes grow larger, he recognized their unmistakable profiles. These were not the stubby Thunderbolts or twin-boomed Lightnings they had previously engaged. These were North American P-51B Mustangs. They flew through the sky confidently, aware they had fuel, altitude, and time to hunt. 730 heavy bombers from the 8th Air Force were approaching Berlin. This was not the usual feint toward the capital that turned toward secondary targets. This was a direct assault on the heart of the Third Reich. For the first time in aerial warfare, single-engine fighters would escort them all the way there and back. Kogler and his formation of 7 twin-engine aircraft did not realize this moment would trigger a profound psychological collapse in military aviation. It would not only destroy aircraft and pilots, but also demolish the belief system that had upheld German air superiority since 1939. The mathematics of annihilation were being written in the contrails streaking across the sky. The sky over Brandenburg at Angels 28 was filled with shock. In truth, the tension had been building for weeks. However, very few in the Luftwaffe's high command had pieced the clues together. On January 11, 1944, Major Hermann Graf, who led JG-11, came across American single-engine fighters near Brunswick. This location was 150 miles deeper into Germany than these fighters should have been able to reach. In his report, he suggested that these fighters had refueled at secret bases in Sweden. Berlin dismissed this as a result of combat fatigue affecting his judgment. But the sightings kept increasing. On January 29th, the reports came from Hanover. Then, on February 3rd, they appeared from Magdy. Each report pushed the boundaries of American fighter range further east, yet each was met with official denials. The Reich Air Ministry issued a directive on February 15th. It stated clearly that reports of American single-engine fighters beyond the Ruhr were misidentifications of twin-engine P-38s or friendly aircraft. Pilots reporting such claims would face medical evaluations. The reality was far more troubling than any conspiracies from Sweden or pilot delusions. At Wright Field in Ohio, American engineers had achieved what German experts deemed physically impossible. They extended the P-51B Mustang's combat range to over 650 miles with expendable auxiliary fuel tanks. This seemed to defy basic aerodynamics. A single-engine fighter capable of flying 1,300 miles while keeping combat performance was an engineering impossibility according to German calculations. Hedman Heinznock, who commanded the 2nd Squadron of Jagdgeschwader 11, wrote in his diary in early 1944 about their precise calculations. They believed American single-engine fighters could escort their bombers only 280 miles from their bases in England, no further. This gave them all of central and eastern Germany as a hunting ground to attack bomber streams without interference. It appeared to be simple arithmetic. Fuel capacity divided by consumption rate equals range. They thought the Americans could not alter the laws of physics, but the Americans had not changed physics. They had simply used them more inventively than anyone in the German high command had imagined. The secret was not in the aircraft itself, but in 2 groundbreaking innovations that German intelligence either overlooked or labeled as propaganda. These were the Packard-built Merlin engine and the British-designed paper drop tanks. The engine in the P-51B was not just a simple copy of the Rolls-Royce Merlin. It was an enhanced version built to tolerances that surpassed the original British standards. Using American mass production techniques from Detroit's automotive industry, Packard accomplished something impressive. This engine delivered 1,490 horsepower at sea level and crucially maintained over 1,200 horsepower at 30,000 feet because of its two-stage, two-speed supercharger. In February 1944, Oberfeldwebel Konrad Bauer, a technical expert with Jagdgeschwader 26, inspected a wrecked P-51B near Gütersloh. His report, found in Luftwaffe archives after the war, highlights the astonishment of the Germans. The engine design is a marvel of engineering efficiency. The intercooler system alone is more advanced than anything in our Daimler-Benz 605. Most remarkably, the quality of production is outstanding. Every piece is machined with precision akin to that of a jeweler. Yet, we hear that the Americans produce 3 of these engines every hour. If this is true, this war is not just about pilots, but about production lines. The drop tanks offered an even more refined solution. Made from pressed paper mixed with plastic resin, these 108-gallon auxiliary tanks weighed only 35 pounds when empty, lighter than the ammunition for one of the Mustangs' machine guns. British engineers at the Royal Aircraft Establishment created this laminated paper technique, allowing the tanks to hold fuel for around 5 hours before starting to decay. This was sufficient for the 2.5-hour flight to Berlin. German engineers had tried using auxiliary tanks, but their designs reflected a key philosophical difference. The German tanks were metal, reusable, costly, and heavy. They significantly hampered performance, leaving fighters carrying them vulnerable to attack. In contrast, the American paper tanks were inexpensive, disposable, and lightweight. A P-51B, equipped with 2 108-gallon drop tanks, could fly to Berlin, drop the tanks in seconds when entering combat, and still fight at full capacity. Lieutenant Colonel Hubert Zenke, who led the 56th Fighter Group, described the tactical shift in a briefing in 1944. The Germans expected us to carefully manage our fuel to ensure enough was left for combat and return. However, with drop tanks, we could burn fuel freely. We could fly to Berlin on external tanks, drop them, and still engage in combat effectively. We had a full internal fuel load for 30 minutes of combat at full throttle, plus the flight back home. We were no longer flying on the edge. We had a margin to spare. To grasp the psychological impact of March 6, 1944, we first need to understand the trauma from October 40, 1943, known as Black Thursday. That day, the 8th Air Force attempted to bomb the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt without long-range fighter escort. Out of 291 B-17 flying fortresses that entered German airspace, 60 were shot down, and 138 were damaged. This resulted in a loss rate of 20% and over 600 casualties among airmen. The Luftwaffe proved that unescorted daylight bombing was not viable. General Ira Eaker, who was commanding the 8th Air Force, had to halt deep penetration raids altogether. General Major Adolf Galland, who was a general of fighters, labeled October 14th as the greatest victory for the Jagdwaffe in the defensive war. In his memoir, The First and the Last, he stated that after Schweinfurt, they believed they had shown daylight precision bombing was a failed idea. He thought the Americans would have to join the British in night bombing, where accuracy was not possible and damage was limited. They thought they had won the theoretical battle. However, Galland, despite being a brilliant tactician, made a significant error. He believed the Americans would stick to the limitations of existing technology rather than find new solutions. When reports of a new American fighter with remarkable range reached him in December 1943, he dismissed them. When his own pilots reported single-engine fighters over Hanover in January 1944, he accused them of seeing things. It wasn't until February 20th, 1944, the first day of Big Week, that Galland started to comprehend the scale of the threat. The Americans launched 1,000 bombers with 835 fighter escorts, marking the first large-scale use of P-51B Mustangs. Over the next 5 days, the Luftwaffe lost 262 fighters and, more critically, 100 experienced pilots, which was 17% of their veteran fighter force. Major Wilhelm Ferdinand Wutz, Gallen's younger brother who commanded 3 JG-26, reported after Big Week that the arrival of the Mustangs changed everything. Previously, they could position themselves beyond fighter range and attack the bombers methodically. Now, they had to fight through escorts just to reach the bombers and then fight their way out. The mission turned into a fight for survival from takeoff to landing. On the morning of March 6, 1944, the skies over northern Europe were clear and cold. It was ideal flying weather. At RAF Laxton in England, ground crews worked overnight. They were preparing the 357th Fighter Group for their most daring mission ever. This was the first P-51 unit assigned to escort all the way to Berlin. Colonel Henry Spicer, the leader of the 357th Fighter Group, held a briefing at 0600 hours. He told his pilots, "Gentlemen, today we go to Big B for the full distance. We will be in enemy territory for 4 hours. Any man who feels his aircraft is not in perfect condition should abort now. There will be no second chances at these distances." No one decided to abort. However, shortly after takeoff, Colonel Spicer had to turn back due to mechanical issues. Major Thomas L. Hayes then took command of the mission. At 0830, 730 heavy bombers began taking off from bases throughout East Anglia. Following them, 796 fighters stood ready to provide relay escort. P-47s would handle the initial phase. P-38s would cover the middle, while P-51 Mustangs took charge of the deepest penetration and target escort. The 357th Fighter Group launched 48 P-51Bs. However, only 33 would make it to Berlin due to mechanical problems and navigation issues amid thick cloud cover. In Germany, the Reich's air defense radar stations began to track the large formation as it assembled over the North Sea. The plotters at Dobritz, Berlin's primary fighter control center, initially thought this was just another false alarm. The Americans had come close to Berlin before, but always turned back to strike targets in western Germany. Obus Hannes Trautloft, who led the 2nd Fighter Division in charge of defending Berlin, analyzed the plot and made a crucial decision. He chose to keep his fighters grounded until the bombers committed to their target. He saw no point in wasting fuel on what could be another deception. At 11:30 hours, the lead bombers entered German airspace near Arnhem. The escorting P-47s engaged German fighters taking off from bases in Holland and western Germany. Everything unfolded as expected. The Luftwaffe pilots acted cautiously, anticipating the moment when the American escorts would reach their fuel limits and retreat. At 12:55 hours, as the bombers approached Berlin, Major Hans Kogler led the charge. His mixed formation aimed to intercept what they thought would be unescorted bombers. He led 7 Messerschmitt Bf-110 night fighters that had been pressed into daytime service, along with 41 single-engine Bf-109s. German controllers tracked the P-47s retreating and assumed the bombers were now defenseless. Major Thomas Hayes, leading the 357th Fighter Group's 33 Mustangs through difficult weather to Berlin, later detailed the moment in his combat report. They broke through the clouds and spotted B-24 Liberators below and to their left. At the same time, they noticed around 40 enemy aircraft preparing for an attack. These included Messerschmitt 100s and 109s. The Germans had not seen them yet. They held the advantage in altitude and surprise. The German formation, focused entirely on the bombers, did not notice the Mustangs until it was far too late. Hayes dove toward the enemy fighters, calling out, "Greenhouse Squadron, this is Greenhouse Leader. Bandits at 2 o'clock low, drop tanks and attack." Feldwebel Jan Miller of JG-11, piloting one of the escorting Bf-109s, survived the battle and later recounted his experience. They were in the perfect position, starting their attack dive on the bombers when tracers zipped past his cockpit. He looked up to see single-engine fighters with American markings diving at them from above. It was unbelievable. They were over Berlin. His first thought was that these must be captured planes or some sort of trick. But then he saw the drop tanks falling away, dozens of them, and realized these were real American fighters with a range that surprised him. What ensued was not a true battle, but a slaughter. The German fighters, caught completely off guard and out of position, scattered in confusion. In 12 minutes of combat, the 357th Fighter Group claimed 20 enemy aircraft destroyed without losing a single P-51. Hayes himself shot down a Bf-109 at low level near Welzow, and then led other Mustangs in strafing a German airfield. Meanwhile, at his estate at Karenhol, 50 miles north of Berlin, Reich Marshal Hermann Göring was having lunch when he received an alarming call from General Adolf Galland. "American fighters are over Berlin. Single-engine fighters," Galland reported. "You're mistaken, Galland," Göring replied flatly. "Check your reports again." "Reich Marshal, I have visual confirmation from multiple sources. P-51 Mustangs are engaging our fighters over Potsdam at this very moment." Göring's fury was explosive. With his aide present, Hermann Göring burned with anger at von Brauchitsch. He smashed his wineglass against the wall and shouted, "This is treason, sabotage." He claimed the pilots were lying to hide their cowardice. He vowed to court-martial anyone who made such allegations. Yet the evidence was clear. From his estate, he could see the trails left by planes over Berlin. He could hear the distant roar of aircraft engines. His aide later recounted that Göring stood silently at the window for nearly an hour, watching the sky. That evening, he issued a notorious order. Any pilot who claimed to have seen American single-engine fighters over Berlin would face charges of cowardice and spreading defeatist propaganda. Göring insisted that the maximum range of American fighters was the Ruhr. This was a scientific fact. His order caused chaos among fighter units already struggling after heavy losses. Pilots who had just survived encounters with P-51s were now at risk of court-martial for sharing their experiences. Several squadron leaders, including Major Gaural, disregarded the order. They instructed their pilots to report twin-engine fighters in their combat logs. General Major Adolf Galland, during a heated meeting at the Air Ministry on March 8th, presented Göring with a piece of a P-51's drop tank. It was clearly marked "Made in USA" and had been found near Magdeburg. Göring's response became legendary within the Luftwaffe. "I don't care if you bring me a whole Mustang on a silver platter. The Americans cannot escort to Berlin. It's scientifically impossible." According to Galland's memoirs, it was at this moment that he realized Germany had lost the war. Later at the Nuremberg trials, Göring would admit, "When I saw American fighters over Berlin, I knew the jig was up." For individual Luftwaffe pilots, the sight of Mustangs over Berlin was not only a tactical shock, but also a crisis of existence. They had been repeatedly told they defended an impenetrable fortress. They were assured that German science and engineering were superior to anything the Allies could muster. Hauptmann Heinz Knoke, who led the 2nd Squadron of Jagdgeschwader 11, wrote in his diary on March 7, 1944, "Yesterday changed everything. We always knew where we were safe, where we could regroup, where we could attack without interference. That certainty is gone. If they can reach Berlin, they can reach anywhere." Hunters turned into the hunted, even over our own capital. The psychological effect grew due to the strength of the enemy. The P-51B was not just present above Berlin, it was a force to be reckoned with. Its Merlin engine reached a top speed of 437 miles per hour at 25,000 feet, much faster than the Bf-109 G6's 386 miles per hour at the same altitude. Its laminar flow wing offered excellent handling at high altitudes. Its 450 caliber machine guns provided intense firepower. Most importantly, its pilots were fresh, not worn out from hours of combat with limited fuel. Unterpizia Vera PC of Jagdgeschwader 301 survived an encounter with P-51s on March 9th. He shared his experience. "The enemy came from above and behind, always with the upper hand in altitude. When we attempted to engage, they would climb away. They had the ability to go vertical whenever they wanted. When we tried to escape by diving, they followed with ease. They fought as if they had infinite fuel, making repeated passes and tracking us down to low altitudes. We were used to American fighters that had to conserve fuel. They would make one pass and then return home. These Mustangs toyed with us like cats playing with mice." Johannes Steinhoff, who led Jagdgeschwader 77, later noted the strategic change. "We had to assume that every bomber formation had Mustang escorts, even if we could not see them. Large formation attacks were no longer a viable option. We could not waste time positioning ourselves. We had to engage immediately with whatever we had, accepting higher losses, and hoping to reach the bombers before the Mustangs found us. The arrival of the Mustangs over Berlin came during another crisis. The Luftwaffe was facing a fuel shortage. Germany had always relied on synthetic fuel production, converting coal into aviation gasoline through the Bergius hydrogenation process. This method required large industrial plants, which were vulnerable to precise bombing. Before March 1944, these synthetic fuel facilities were largely safe from attacks. They were too far from England for accurate bombing with fighter escort. The math was straightforward. Without escort, bombers could not survive long enough over the target for precision strikes. Without precision, the massive concrete structures of the hydrogenation plants were unlikely to suffer significant damage. The Mustang changed this situation overnight. On May 12, 1944, the 8th Air Force launched its first significant attack on the synthetic fuel plant at Luna, located 100 miles away. To the southwest of Berlin, 800 bombers, supported by 735 fighters, including 298 P-51s, dropped 1,718 tons of bombs with unmatched precision. Production at Luna fell by 90% overnight. By June 1944, German aviation fuel production dropped from 175,000 tons each month to just 35,000 tons. By September, it plummeted further to 7,000 tons, barely enough for 500 sorties a day across all fronts. Training flights were completely canceled. New pilots were going into combat with as little as 50 hours of total flight time, far below the standard 250 hours from 1942. A veteran pilot who moved from the Eastern Front to the Reich Defense shared insights on the worsening situation. By the summer of 1944, they started with one training flight per week, then it became one per month, and eventually none at all. New pilots came to their units without ever having fired their weapons in flight, without knowing formation flying, and without experiencing mock combat. They were easy targets. The issue was not just fuel, but also the lack of experience and confidence, the essential qualities of a fighter pilot. The true effect of the P-51 Mustang became evident on June 6, 1944, D-Day. The largest amphibious invasion ever required complete air dominance over the beaches. The Allies conducted 14,674 sorties, while the Luftwaffe managed only 319, losing 35 aircraft in the process. Over the invasion beaches, only 2 German fighters appeared that day. Oberstleutnant Pips Priller, leading JG-26, executed the only Luftwaffe attack on the beaches. Alongside his wingman, Unteroffizier Heinz Vodacek, he made a single strafing run on Sword Beach before retreating from Spitfires. In his post-war memoir, Priller remarked, "2 planes. That's all we could muster against the greatest invasion in history. Not due to a lack of courage, but because we lacked fuel and aircraft. Above all, we lacked air superiority. The Mustangs had stripped that from us months earlier, not over Normandy, but over Berlin." Major Vero, who commanded 3G-54 and claimed a P-51 on May 24, 1944, reflected on the strategic situation. After the Mustangs appeared over Berlin, they never regained the initiative. They were always reacting, always defending, always outnumbered. The Americans could attack anywhere at any time with fighter support. They could barely protect their own airfields. The struggle for control of the skies was lost the moment the Mustangs could reach Berlin. In a state of desperation, the Luftwaffe resorted to increasingly reckless tactics. The Sturmgruppe assault group represented this desperation effectively. The Focke-Wulf FW-190A8s were enhanced with extra armor, 30mm cannons, and reinforced windshields. These flying tanks would dive straight through fighter defenses to strike bombers at close range. Major Walter Dahl, who took command of Jagdgeschwader 300 on June 27, 1944, became the most notable advocate of these tactics. On July 7, 1944, Dahl led 4 Sturm JG-3, supported by 2 groups of Bf-109s from JG-300, in a large-scale assault against B-24 Liberators near Leipzig. The heavily armored FW-190s managed to take down an entire squadron of 12 B-24s from the 492nd Bomb Group in less than a minute, but the losses were severe. 9 of the Sturmgruppe fighters were shot down, and 3 had to make crash landings. The escorting Bf-109s fared even worse against the P-51 Mustang escorts. Tactics that had worked for a short time in July became increasingly deadly as American fighter strength grew. Oberfeldwebel Konrad Bauer, one of the few Sturmgruppe pilots to survive many missions, described their grim reality. He said they felt like flying coffins. The armor intended to protect them slowed them down so much that the Mustangs could attack them multiple times without worry. The order was to ram if their guns jammed, but how could they ram when they couldn't even reach the bombers through the fighter screen? Each mission felt like playing Russian roulette with all chambers loaded. Germany's last hope rested in revolutionary technology. The Messerschmitt Me 262 Schwalbe, the world's first operational jet fighter, had a top speed of 540 miles per hour, making it 100 miles per hour faster than the P-51D. In the hands of skilled pilots, it could have shifted the balance of the air war. However, the Me-262 arrived too late and in too few numbers. More importantly, Hitler's insistence on using it as a blitz bomber instead of a fighter interceptor led to wasted months. By the time enough jets were ready for fighter operations in late 1944, the Luftwaffe lacked the fuel to train pilots and the airfields to operate them safely. Adolf Galland, who was removed from his position as General der Jagdflieger for criticizing Hitler's strategies, received command of JV-44, an elite jet unit formed in February 1945. Yet, even with Germany's best surviving pilots at the controls of the most advanced fighter, they could not overcome the overwhelming numerical advantage of Allied forces. Galland described the hopelessness of our situation. We would take off and manage to shoot down 1 or 2 bombers or fighters. However, we would return to find our airfield under attack by Mustangs. They hunted us on the ground, targeting our Messerschmitt Me-262s during their most vulnerable moments of takeoff and landing. For every minute we spent in the air, Mustangs patrolled above for an hour. Technology that lacks numbers, fuel, and infrastructure is ultimately useless. By autumn 1944, the Luftwaffe faced what historians would later label the death of the expert. Our veteran pilots, who had achieved dozens or even hundreds of victories, were being killed faster than we could train replacements. The Mustangs' presence deep in Germany meant there was no safe area to train new pilots. There was no quiet sector for novices to gain experience. The statistics reveal a bleak reality. In 1940, new Luftwaffe pilots received 250 hours of flight training before combat. By 1944, this dropped to just 80 hours. By early 1945, some pilots went into battle with as little as 20 hours of experience in their aircraft. In contrast, American pilots arriving in England typically had between 400 and 500 hours of flight time, including 100 hours in their aircraft, as well as extensive gunnery training. Johannes Steinhoff, who suffered severe burns when his Messerschmitt Me-262 crashed on takeoff in April 1945, later remarked, "We were sending children to their deaths. Boys who could barely fly in formation were expected to face Mustang pilots with hundreds of combat hours. It wasn't combat, it was murder." I stopped looking at the faces of the replacement pilots. I understood that most would be dead within a week. The loss rates validate this grim outlook. In January 1945, the average life expectancy of a new Luftwaffe fighter pilot was only 7 missions. Some units experienced a complete turnover in just a month. Jagdgeschwader 301, once an elite unit, lost 82 pilots in the first 3 months of 1945, while claiming only 41 victories. Lieutenant G.A., who survived the war with 3 victories, shared his experience as a newly qualified pilot. "My first mission was supposed to be a training flight, a patrol over Brunswick with experienced pilots. We were intercepted by Mustangs before we could even properly form up. My flight leader was killed in the first attack. I never saw the Mustang that shot at me, only the tracers passing by my canopy. I dove to treetop level and returned home alone. That was my combat training." While the Luftwaffe suffered great losses in the skies, American bombing campaigns relentlessly destroyed German aircraft production. The long range of the Mustangs meant that no factory was safe. Major production centers in Regensburg, Augsburg, Wiener Neustadt, and Leipzig faced repeated attacks with pinpoint precision. After the war, Albert Speer, the Reich Minister for Armaments and War Production, shared that the Mustang allowed the Americans to keep constant pressure on our aircraft industry. We would repair a factory, resume production, and within days, it would be destroyed again. We started moving production into caves and forests, but that increased costs and dropped efficiency by 75%. In 1944, we produced more fighters than in 1943, yet it was not enough to replace our losses. We lacked both fuel for the aircraft and pilots to fly them. The numbers reflect this reality. German fighter production hit its peak at 3,300 aircraft in September 1944. However, losses that month reached 3,217. The Luftwaffe was losing aircraft faster than the world's most efficient industrial economy could replace them. Also, the quality of the hastily assembled aircraft was declining. New planes were suffering from engine failures, structural weaknesses, and system malfunctions. Ober-engineer Kurt Tank, the designer of the FW-190, visited frontline units in December 1944 and was shocked by what he observed. Aircraft were arriving with serious defects. Engines that were meant to run for 100 hours were failing after just 10. Control surfaces were getting stuck and weapons were misaligned. We had gone from making the best fighters in the world to delivering flying death traps. Our workers were worn out, the materials were of poor quality, and proper testing was non-existent. We were undermining ourselves. On January 1st, 1945, the Luftwaffe launched Operation Bodenplatte, a massive surprise attack on Allied airfields in Belgium and the Netherlands. 900 fighters, which represented almost the entire remaining strength of the Luftwaffe in the West, took off at dawn. Many pilots were on their first combat mission. Most had never flown in formations larger than 4 aircraft. The mission was so secret that German anti-aircraft units were not informed, leading to severe friendly fire incidents. The attack caught the Allies completely off guard. 305 Allied aircraft were destroyed on the ground, and 190 were damaged, but the cost was devastating. The Luftwaffe lost 271 aircraft, and more critically, 213 pilots, including many irreplaceable experienced leaders. Gruppenkommandeur and 14 Staffelkapitane were either killed or captured. Our survivor, Jan Kogler, labeled it the Luftwaffe's death ride. We destroyed aircraft, yet the Americans replaced them within a week. We lost pilots who could never be replaced. To make matters worse, we exhausted our last reserves of fuel. After Bodenplatte, we were a depleted force. We could not even pretend to challenge the skies anymore. The American response was immediate and ruthless. Within 48 hours, Mustang sweeps systematically hunted the weakened German fighter units. Airfields faced repeated strafing. In the week after Bodenplatte, the Luftwaffe lost another 400 aircraft, mostly on the ground. Major John Meyer from the 352nd Fighter Group, who claimed 24 aerial victories, reflected on the period after Bodenplatte. He said it was almost sad. We found German airfields filled with planes that could not fly due to lack of fuel. We strafed them, they caught fire, and there was no resistance. It was no longer combat. It was execution. As 1945 moved forward, the Luftwaffe ceased to function as an effective force. Individual pilots still flew solo missions, but coordinated operations were out of reach. The sight of Mustangs over any German airfield meant likely destruction. Pilots began to refuse flying, not out of cowardice, but from the stark realization that taking off meant certain death with no impact on the war's outcome. The psychological impact was severe. Heinz Koka, who had once written passionately about defending the Reich, made his final published diary entry. He expressed the loss of countless friends in his unit. Boys he trained, flew with, and loved like brothers were all dead. He asked, for what? They could no longer reach the bombers. The Mustangs dominated the skies. He stated he was not a fighter pilot anymore. He felt like a target just waiting to die. The Luftwaffe's own records captured after the war reveal the grim statistics. In January 1944, there were 2,395 fighter pilots ready for operations. By June 1944, the number dropped to 1,523 fighter pilots. On D-Day, there were 742 fighter pilots available. By April 1945, about 200 fighter pilots were still flying. Of the Luftwaffe pilots operational on January 1, 1944, fewer than 5% survived the war without injury. The arrival of Mustangs over Berlin signaled a complete annihilation that wiped out an entire generation of German aviators. After the war, surviving Luftwaffe pilots were surprisingly open about the effects of the P-51 Mustang. Their accounts, gathered by Allied intelligence officers and later historians, reveal the psychological breakdown of a previously dominant force. Adolf Galland, despite his wartime dismissal and disputes with Nazi leadership, became a respected voice regarding the Luftwaffe's defeat. In a 1954 interview, he remarked, "The P-51 Mustang was the key weapon in the air war over Germany. It wasn't the best fighter in every respect. The Spitfire had better turning ability. The FW-190 could roll better. The Me-262 was faster, but the Mustang excelled in many areas and could operate anywhere. Once it flew over Berlin, we realized the war was lost. It was like a chess game where your opponent suddenly gains queens that can move anywhere." Johannes Steinhoff, who endured severe burns after his Me-262 crashed in April 1945, later became Chief of Staff of the post-war German Air Force and Chairman of the NATO Military Committee. His assessment was just as harsh. The Mustang did not only defeat the Luftwaffe, it shattered the very idea of German air superiority. We had based our entire defensive strategy on the belief that Germany was safe from single-engine fighters. When that belief was proven wrong, everything fell apart. This was not merely a tactical defeat, it was a strategic disaster from which we never bounced back. Perhaps the most heartfelt testimony came from Heinz Koch, whose diary captured the journey from confidence to collapse. At a 1975 reunion of former foes, he encountered Colonel Clarence Bud Anderson, a triple ace who flew Mustangs with the 357 Fighter Group. Koch told him, "You must understand, when we first saw your Mustangs over Berlin, it felt like finding out the ocean has no end. We had been told we were winning, that America was too distant to affect us. Then suddenly you were there over our capital with fuel to spare. It shattered something in us, not just our will to fight, but our belief in everything we were told." Erich Hartmann, the war's top-scoring ace with 352 victories, survived by crafting specific tactics against the Mustang. He would only attack when he had every advantage and would retreat immediately if Mustangs appeared. In his post-war interviews, he admitted, "Fighting Mustangs was not combat as we understood it. It became a fight for survival. The Luftwaffe had every advantage: numbers, altitude, fuel, and increasingly skilled pilots. We could only hope to endure and maybe catch a straggler off guard." The influence of the P-51 Mustang in the air war over Europe shows clear numbers that highlight the extent of American victories and the total defeat of Germany. The P-51s claimed 4,950 aerial victories. They also destroyed an additional 4,131 enemy planes on the ground. This accounted for nearly 49% of all claims made by the United States Army Air Forces in Europe. In terms of losses, the P-51 had a combat loss rate of only 1.2% per sortie. In contrast, the Luftwaffe's loss rate by 1945 was 18% per sortie. The overall kill ratio stood at approximately 3.6 to 1, favoring the P-51. Before the Mustang, the bomber loss rate was 9.1% per mission. After the Mustang, it dropped to 2.5% per mission, leading to a 68% decrease in bomber crew casualties. The range of aircraft changed drastically. The P-47 Thunderbolt had a combat radius of 375 miles. The P-38 Lightning had a combat radius of 450 miles. The P-51B and C Mustang had a combat radius of 650 miles with drop tanks. The P-51D Mustang could reach a combat radius of 750 miles with drop tanks. All of German territory was within the reach of the P-51. In terms of production, a total of 15,686 P-51s were made, with the peak production rate reaching 320 per month. Each aircraft cost $51,000 in 1945. In 1944, Germany produced 25,860 fighters, but only about 1,500 were operational at any time. Regarding pilot experience, American pilots arriving in Europe from 1944 to 1945 averaged 400 hours of flight time. German pilots entering combat during that same period averaged only 80 hours of flight time. The survival rate for Luftwaffe pilots was less than 15%. Meanwhile, American fighter pilots completed their tours at a rate of 65%. The sight of Mustangs flying over Berlin signified more than just a tactical win. It marked a strategic shift in air warfare. For the first time, a nation held the power to exert dominant air influence over the entire territory of another major power. This had implications beyond World War II. General Karl Spaatz, who commanded the United States Strategic Air Forces in Europe, noted in his report, "The P-51 Mustang gave us air supremacy over Europe. Not just air superiority, which implies ongoing competition, but complete air supremacy, total control. By spring of 1944, we could target any place at any time with manageable losses. This was not merely a military edge, but a psychological weapon. German morale, both military and civilian, faltered when they realized our reach was everywhere, all the time." A wave of strategic consequences led to industrial paralysis. No German factory was secure. Production had to shift to hidden facilities that were inefficient. Transportation networks faced constant disruptions. The German economy, already under pressure, began to collapse entirely. The fuel crisis worsened. Synthetic fuel plants, once thought untouchable, were systematically destroyed. This resulted in a downward spiral. Less fuel meant reduced pilot training. This led to higher combat losses, which in turn meant even less fuel for training. With the Luftwaffe pushed from the skies, Allied ground forces could operate freely. The breakout from Normandy, the advance across France, and the crossing of the Rhine were all possible because German forces could only move at night. The psychological impact was significant. The sight of American fighters over the capital of Germany shattered the illusion of German invincibility. Civilians who had been told America was weak and distant saw silver Mustangs flying overhead without opposition. Germany had started the war with technological advantages in several areas. The Bf-109 was possibly the best fighter in the world in 1939. German pilots were highly trained, many having combat experience from the Spanish Civil War. German tactics, especially the finger four formation and energy fighting techniques, were groundbreaking. However, the Mustang represented something unique. It combined British innovation with the Merlin engine and American mass production from North American aviation, using techniques from the automobile industry and continuous improvements based on combat experience. It was not the brainchild of a single genius, but a result of collaborative refinement. The P-51D, arriving in May 1944, featured many enhancements based on combat feedback. The bubble canopy offered 360-degree visibility. It had 6 50-caliber machine guns with an improved ammunition feed, the K-14 computing gun sight, strengthened wings for extra ordnance, and advanced radio equipment. The Packard 5165U-7 engine provided 1,590 horsepower. Each modification targeted specific combat needs identified by pilots. This feedback loop, where combat experience drove rapid design improvements, resulting in better combat performance, was something the German system, hindered by chaotic leadership and disrupted production, could not replicate. Dr. Kurt Tank, the designer of the FW-190, acknowledged after the war that they could design aircraft on par with or superior to the Mustang. The TA-152H had several advantages, but we faced significant issues. We could not produce them in large numbers, maintain a steady fuel supply, or effectively train pilots to operate them. The Americans not only created a superior fighter, but they also developed a better system for designing, producing, and employing those fighters. The German reaction to the Mustang showcased serious flaws in the Nazi system. Instead of recognizing the threat and adapting, they chose to deny reality. Hitler insisted on focusing on bomber production instead of fighters. They failed to protect their skilled pilots, forcing them to fly until they were lost. Rather than acknowledging their strategic mistakes, they silenced pilots who reported the truth. This approach had a particularly devastating effect on Germany's renowned aces. These men had achieved dozens, if not hundreds, of victories and were symbols of German military might. The arrival of the Mustang led to their systematic elimination. Major Klaus Mitusch, with 72 victories, was killed by P-51s on September 17, 1944. He had survived 452 combat missions only to be targeted by Mustangs during an attack formation. Oberst Walter Osar, known for his 123 victories, was shot down by P-38s on May 11, 1944. Even older American fighters became increasingly deadly as the quality of German pilots deteriorated. Major Hans Philipp, with 206 victories, was brought down by P-47s on October 8, 1943, before the Mustangs entered service in full force. His death foreshadowed what lay ahead. The losses continued, a grim tally of Germany's best pilots taken out one by one. By the end of the war, out of 107 German pilots who had achieved 100 or more victories, 95 were dead, seriously wounded, or captured. The Mustang had not only defeated the Luftwaffe, it had obliterated its institutional memory. As 1945 began, the Luftwaffe existed more in name than in reality. Aircraft were concealed in forests, disguised on fake farmland, or moved to highway strips. Pilots lived like hunted prey, constantly on the move to evade the ever-present Mustangs. Oberst Gordon Golub, one of the few senior commanders still alive, issued desperate orders. Aircraft would only take off when enemy bombers were directly overhead. The maximum sortie duration was set at 15 minutes. Any pilot in the air for more than 20 minutes would be presumed to have defected. The fear of Mustangs had become so overwhelming that many pilots would turn back at the first sighting of escort fighters. Calling out cowardice among pilots became a common practice. However, executing experienced aviators when so few were left proved counterproductive. Morale hit rock bottom when pilots realized that even successful missions amounted to nothing. The bombers continued to come. The Mustangs kept escorting them, and Germany kept suffering. Lieutenant Heinrich Bartels, who had 99 victories, was shot down and killed on December 23, 1944. He was just one victory away from becoming a century ace. His wingman reported 6 Mustangs that came from above and behind. Heinrich never stood a chance. They followed him down, firing continuously. Even as his aircraft burned, they kept shooting. They aimed to showcase their ruthlessness. Earlier in the war, there had been some degree of chivalry. Pilots who bailed out were generally not attacked. Damaged aircraft trying to retreat were sometimes allowed to escape. But by 1945, American pilots had lost too many friends. They knew the war's end was near and wanted to ensure the Luftwaffe could never recover. Each German pilot killed was one less who could operate the jet fighters Germany was still trying to develop. American Mustang pilots were consistent in how they viewed the campaign's progress. Colonel John C. Murr, who achieved 24 aerial victories, provided this insight. From March to June 1944, we faced the Luftwaffe's best team, experienced, aggressive, and skilled. From June to December, we encountered their second line. They were still dangerous, but less coordinated. By 1945, we were shooting down trainees, youngsters who could barely fly in formation, much less fight. It was not satisfying. It was necessary, yet tragic. Lieutenant Colonel John B. England, commanding the 362nd Fighter Squadron, noted that the Mustang provided not just range, but also psychological dominance. German pilots understood that if they spotted Mustangs, death was likely. We could see this change in their tactics. At the beginning, they would attack aggressively, even when outnumbered. By late 1944, they would flee at the first sight of us. By 1945, many would not even take off if Mustangs were reported nearby. Captain Charles Chuck Jorger, who would later break the sound barrier, scored 11.5 victories in Mustangs. His assessment was to the point. The P-51 was an honest airplane. It delivered on its promises. It had no flaws if treated properly. Against German fighters in 1944 and 1945, it was like having a rifle while they had muskets. We had the edge in speed and capability. The factors at play included range, altitude, and the number of planes involved. It was not a fair fight, but war rarely is. A poignant reflection came from bomber crews who relied on fighter escorts. Technical Sergeant William McManus, a B-17 gunner with the 100th Bomb Group, remembered, "Before the Mustangs, every mission felt like suicide. We would watch our escort turn back and know the wolves were coming." After March 1944, seeing those Mustangs flying alongside us to the target and back was like having guardian angels. Our loss rate shifted from likely death to a good chance of returning home. The success of the P-51 was not just a victory of design, but also a result of efficient production. North American Aviation's factories in Inglewood, California, and Dallas, Texas, reached production levels that seemed extraordinary by German standards. At peak production in 1944, North American was completing one Mustang every 63 minutes. The assembly line, adapted from car manufacturing, divided construction into specialized stations. Workers became experts at specific tasks, achieving speed and precision unmatched by traditional aircraft manufacturing methods. Paul Peters, a production supervisor at Inglewood, explained the system. We had housewives installing control cables, teenagers riveting wing panels, and men too old for the draft assembling engines. None of them had built an airplane before the war, but the system was so well designed that within weeks they were turning out perfect work. Quality control was maintained at every station. If something was not right, the line stopped until it was corrected. The difference with German production was significant. As Allied bombing led to dispersal, German aircraft were being assembled in caves, forests, and abandoned mines. Various components might come from hundreds of miles away. Quality control was nearly impossible. Many workers were slave laborers without motivation to improve production. Oberst Dietrich Rabach, who led various fighter units throughout the war, noted, "We received new aircraft that looked perfect but were flying coffins, with control cables installed incorrectly, fuel lines that leaked, and guns that failed to fire. The Americans were building better aircraft in greater numbers, with workers who wanted to win. We were producing inferior aircraft in fewer numbers, with workers who wished for our defeat." The P-51's success over Berlin had consequences that went well beyond the European theater. It showed how air power could be used worldwide. Distance was no longer a limit for American forces. Japan was well aware of this as they saw their defensive perimeter shrink. American long-range fighters allowed bombing missions against their home islands. Stalin noticed this change too. Soviet pilots who flew Lend-Lease P-51s were struck by their range and reliability. The Soviet Air Force started to create long-range escort fighters, knowing future wars would require power projection over great distances. The Soviet Air Force received 10 P-51s for testing, but never used them in combat. The Mustang continued to serve long after World War II. During the Korean War, F-51s, which got a new designation in 1948, conducted close support missions. The Israeli Air Force used Mustangs during the Suez Crisis in 1956. Various air forces operated Mustangs into the 1980s. The Dominican Air Force retired their last F-51D in 1984, 40 years after it first flew over Berlin. The Mustang's most significant legacy was doctrinal. It showed that air superiority was not just about controlling the airspace over battlefields, but also over entire nations. Every modern air force designs its strategy based on this lesson, first demonstrated when American fighters flew over Berlin on March 6, 1944. Behind the statistics, there were real people, mostly young men in their early 20s, facing extraordinary circumstances. The sight of Mustangs over Berlin meant various things to different observers, but it was a moment of deep realization for all. For American pilots, it brought a sense of vindication. Lieutenant Robert Johnson of the 56th Fighter Group wrote home, "We flew over Hitler's capital today. Think about that. We took off from England, flew across all of Germany, circled Berlin as if it belonged to us because it did, and flew back home. 2 years ago, the Nazis were bombing London. Today, we own the sky over Berlin. It's hard to express the feeling, pride, power, and the absolute certainty that we will win this war." For German pilots, it meant despair. Feldwebel Rudi Miller of JG-302 wrote to his wife, "I saw them today. American fighters over Berlin, single-engine fighters. It's impossible, but I saw them with my own eyes. If they can reach Berlin, they can reach anywhere. There is no safe place left in Germany. How do I express that I don't expect to make it through this? How do I convey that everything we believed was false?" For German civilians, this marked the start of the end of their illusions. In Berlin, Ursula von Kardorff recorded in her diary, "We were told that the Americans were weak, that their Jewish-controlled society could never match German strength." Today, I saw American fighters circling above while our esteemed Luftwaffe was nowhere to be found. They lied to us. If they lied about this, what else was untrue? For the Allied bomber crews, it felt like salvation. Staff Sergeant James McMahon, a ball turret gunner on B-7 Lucky Lady, remembered, as those Mustangs formed up with us while we approached Berlin, I won't hide that I cried. For the first time since starting my missions, I believed I might actually survive the war. Those little planes with their great range saved thousands of us. As the war concluded, the full extent of what the Mustang accomplished became clear. The Luftwaffe, which entered the war as one of the world's most powerful air forces, had become ineffective. The numbers are staggering. From 1944 to 1945, the Luftwaffe lost around 45,000 aircraft. Approximately 15,000 Luftwaffe pilots were killed during that same period. Less than 5% of Luftwaffe pilots operational in January 1944 survived the war uninjured. 61 German cities experienced more than 50% destruction due to bombing. Civilian casualties ranged from 350,000 to 500,000. Industrial production losses from bombing were between 35 and 40%. These figures reflect not just military defeat, but also societal collapse. The Mustang facilitated a campaign that brought destruction to every German city, every factory, and every airfield. There was no safe area and no refuge. Hermann Göring, during his trial in Nuremberg, was asked when he realized Germany had lost the war. His answer became one of the most cited statements of the conflict. When I saw American fighters over Berlin, the game was finished. Everything afterward was just delay, leading to more young men lost for no reason. This was a surprisingly frank admission from a man known for his dishonesty. Yet, even Göring, a master of denial and delusion, could not ignore what the Mustang symbolized. It represented the blend of American industrial strength and British innovation, projected across vast distances with ruthless efficiency. The development of the P-51 from its initial concept to an escort fighter over Berlin is one of the fastest and most successful aircraft programs in history. The NA-73X prototype took to the skies for the first time on October 26, 1940. This happened just 102 days after North American aviation received a request from the British Purchasing Commission. By March 1944, in less than 4 years, the P-51 was escorting bombers all the way to Berlin. This rapid development was complemented by ongoing enhancements based on experiences in combat. Each new version included lessons learned from the battlefield. The P-51A, which had an Allison engine, faced limitations in high-altitude performance. However, the P-51B and C models, equipped with the Packard Merlin F-16 F3 engine, significantly improved performance at altitudes over 20,000 feet. The P-51D featured a bubble canopy and 6 guns, along with the V-1657 engine, enhancing the aircraft's systems. The P-51H had a lighter structure and reached peak performance, but did not see action in Europe. The quick feedback loop from combat experience led to rapid design improvements, a process the German system could not replicate due to chaotic leadership and disrupted production. Although German engineers created technically advanced designs like the TAR-152H or the Me-262, they struggled to refine them based on combat experiences or produce them in significant quantities. The appearance of P-51 Mustangs over Berlin confirmed the entire American strategic bombing strategy. Pre-war theorists such as Billy Mitchell and Giulio Douhet argued that bombing could secure victory by destroying enemy industry and morale. However, it was not until long-range escort fighters became available that this theory turned into reality. The P-51 enabled precision daylight bombing, while the British focused on area bombing at night. American forces could now accurately strike specific facilities like ball-bearing factories, synthetic fuel plants, and aircraft assembly buildings. The difference in accuracy was striking. British night bombing had an average circular error of 3 miles, while American daylight bombing with fighter escorts achieved an error of only 1,000 feet. General Curtis LeMay, who later led the Strategic Air Command, remarked that the P-51 made strategic bombing effective. Without it, the United States would have faced unsustainable losses or had to rely on ineffective night bombing. With the P-51, they could systematically destroy specific targets. The impact was clear. German ball bearing production dropped by 70%, aviation fuel production was cut by 95%, synthetic rubber production fell by 85%, and railroad traffic plummeted by 75%. Canal traffic in western Germany was completely eliminated. The targeted use of force made possible by Mustang escorts shortened the war by months or even years. Every factory that was destroyed, every rail line that was cut, and every fuel depot that was burned meant the German forces could not fight effectively. The image of Mustangs flying over Berlin became one of the most iconic visuals of World War II. It ranks alongside the flag raising on Iwo Jima and Soviet soldiers at the Reichstag. This imagery represented American power, technological superiority, and the certainty of an Allied victory. For Americans, the Mustang became a symbol of industrial and technological strength. It appeared in war bond posters, Hollywood films, and post-war celebrations. The fact that it was designed and built in record time by a company that had never made a fighter before showcased the American spirit of determination. For Germans, the Mustang symbolized humiliation and defeat. In post-war German literature and films, American fighters over German cities depicted the regime's failure to protect its people. The trauma of being unable to defend their airspace left lasting psychological scars on the Luftwaffe veterans who survived. Heinz Koka, writing in 1953, noted that for a fighter pilot, the ultimate duty is to defend their homeland skies. He stated, "We failed." The Mustangs over Berlin were visible proof of that failure for every German who looked up. That shame never fully fades away. Military strategists worldwide still study the Mustang's influence on the European air war to understand how technology can cause a strategic revolution. The lessons learned are timeless. Range equals options. The ability to project power from a distance provides strategic flexibility. The Mustang gave Allied commanders options that the Germans could not counter. Integration beats isolation. The Mustang did not succeed on its own, but as part of a cohesive system. This included bombers, fighters, intelligence, logistics, and training. The Germans had strong individual components, but failed to integrate them effectively. Production wins wars. Creating vast numbers of good aircraft is more effective than having a small number of excellent ones. The Mustang was exceptional, but even more importantly, there were thousands of them available. Pilot quality matters. Technology without well-trained operators is ineffective. American pilot training programs focused on flight hours and realistic combat training, which helped develop pilots who could utilize the Mustang's capabilities to the fullest. Adaptation is key to survival. The Americans continuously refine their strategies, technology, and training using lessons learned from combat. The Germans, bound by strict doctrine and political influence, struggled to adapt quickly. Modern air forces utilize these lessons every day. The focus on long-range strike ability, integrated air defense systems, pilot training, and industrial support stems from what was learned when P-51 Mustangs appeared over Berlin. There was more to the arrival of P-51 Mustangs over Berlin on March 6, 1944, than just a tactical achievement. It represented a collapse of Nazi Germany's core beliefs about the war. The Reich was supposed to stand strong, shielded by distance, defended by elite pilots flying top-notch fighters. The Mustang quickly shattered those illusions. For the German military and political leaders, it was a moment of harsh realization. They had built their entire strategy on the belief that Americans could not project power effectively across the Atlantic. They viewed American industrial strength as weak, American technology as subpar, and American pilots as soft. All those assumptions were wrong. The sight of Mustangs over Berlin was undeniable proof that could not be dismissed or ignored. Adolf Galland would later state, "March 6, 1944 was the day we lost the war. Not when Berlin fell, not when Hitler died, but when American fighters appeared over our capital. Everything afterward was merely the unfolding of a conclusion we could not escape." The Mustang did more than defeat the Luftwaffe. It demonstrated that American industrial democracy could outproduce, out-innovate, and outfight Nazi totalitarianism. The psychological effects were felt throughout German society. If the regime could not protect Berlin from American fighters, what else were they incapable of? If everything they believed about American weaknesses was untrue, what other lies existed? The Mustang unintentionally became an emblem of truth. Its presence over German cities made it clear that the Nazi perspective was founded on falsehoods. While the Mustang's success was critical, it came at a heavy price. A total of 2,520 P-51s were lost in combat in the European theater. Each loss represented a young man who would never return home. The 357th Fighter Group alone lost over 100 pilots in action. These were America's finest. College students, athletes, and young professionals who chose to fly and fight. Lieutenant Colonel Sidney Brooks, the commanding officer of the 339th Fighter Group, lost his life on March 31, 1944. His P-51B was struck by flak near Brunswick. He was just 28 years old, married, and the father of 2 children whom he would never see grow up. This kind of loss was felt thousands of times. Many young men paid the ultimate price for the strategic success that the Mustang achieved. Captain Don Gentile, one of the top Mustang aces with 21.83 aerial victories, survived combat, only to die in a flying accident in January 1951 while testing a T-33 jet trainer. The effects of the war lingered long after the fighting ended. Many Mustang pilots dealt with the trauma of what they had experienced. They carried psychological wounds that never truly healed. Despite the pain, their sacrifices led to an incredible achievement. They brought the war to the enemy's homeland, forcing the enemy to fight on their own territory, and they won decisively. The Luftwaffe never recovered after Mustangs appeared over Berlin. From that moment on, they became a broken force, capable only of sporadic and ineffective resistance. As dawn broke on May 8, 1945, known as Victory in Europe Day, American Mustangs patrolled the skies over a defeated Germany. There was no opposition. The once formidable Luftwaffe, which had terrorized Europe and seemed invincible in 1940, had vanished. Its aircraft lay destroyed or were grounded due to a lack of fuel. Its pilots were dead, wounded, or held as prisoners. The once powerful infrastructure was reduced to rubble. The span from March 6, 1944 to May 8, 1945, just 14 months, represents one of the most complete military victories in history. The P-51 Mustang was the key instrument of that victory. It transformed Allied air power from a costly liability into an unstoppable force. During those 14 months, Mustang pilots executed over 213,000 sorties, claimed 4,950 aerial victories, destroyed 4,131 aircraft on the ground, dropped 31,000 tons of bombs, and fired 99 million rounds of ammunition. Behind these numbers was a human reality. Young American men, with an average age of 22, flew aluminum aircraft powered by Packard-built Merlin engines. They comprehensively dismantled one of history's most formidable air forces. They achieved this not just through individual acts of heroism, although there was much of that, but through superior technology, training, tactics, and industrial support. Colonel Hubert "Hub" Zanka, one of the war's most successful fighter commanders, perhaps best summed up the state of the Luftwaffe. They faced impressive opponents but were utterly outmatched. We had superior numbers in every aspect: more aircraft, more fuel, more pilots, and more training. The Mustang allowed us to utilize that advantage anywhere we wanted. Once we could escort missions to Berlin, victory became a mathematical certainty. When Major Hans Kogler spotted those first Mustangs over Brandenburg on March 6, 1944, he did not just see enemy fighters. He witnessed the future of air combat. The P-51 Mustang showed that technology could bridge distances. It proved that industrial strength could outdo individual skill, and that a systematic approach could conquer improvised talent. The astonished German pilots confronting Mustangs over Berlin were not merely battling a superior aircraft. They confronted the combined industrial, technological, and organizational might of the United States, projected across an ocean and right into their homeland. It was a forceful display that crushed all presumptions about what was possible in air warfare. Hermann Göring's confession about realizing the war was lost upon seeing American fighters over Berlin has become a significant acknowledgement of defeat in history. However, the meaning of that moment transcended one person's realization or a single nation's downfall. The emergence of Mustangs over Berlin marked a pivotal change in warfare. It was when air power turned truly strategic. Industrial capacity outpaced warrior traditions, and organized efficiency surpassed personal heroism. The German pilots, stunned by Mustangs over Berlin, witnessed an event that would resonate for decades. It showcased American power, reaching across great distances with precision and overwhelming strength. Every modern military action, from Korea to Kosovo and Vietnam to the Gulf War, is built on the foundation laid by those initial Mustangs in the skies over Brandenburg. Ultimately, the P-51 Mustang achieved more than just escorting bombers or downing German aircraft. It dismantled the final illusions of a regime founded on falsehoods regarding racial superiority and national fate. It demonstrated that free societies, despite seeming disorder and inefficiency, could organize, innovate, and project power more effectively than totalitarian regimes. It illustrated that, when technology and industry are utilized properly, they can reshape the course of history. The Luftwaffe pilots who gazed up in disbelief at those silver Mustangs on March 6, 1944, were witnessing their own obsolescence. In just 14 months, their entire force would be annihilated, their country occupied, and their ideology discredited. The surprise of seeing these American fighters over Berlin marked the start of a chain of events that would lead to Germany's total defeat and transformation. Today, preserved P-51 Mustangs still soar at air shows. Their unique Merlin engines produce a sound that veterans instantly recognize. For American veterans, it's the sound of victory. For German veterans, it represents the start of the end. For historians, it symbolizes a shift in warfare forever. This moment showcased how one nation could project decisive air power anywhere on Earth. The tale of Luftwaffe pilots confronted by the P-51 Mustangs over Berlin highlights the clash between expectation and reality, between propaganda and truth, and between what seemed impossible and what American industry made commonplace. When those Mustangs appeared, they not only stunned the pilots, but also shattered an entire worldview. Yet, from that destruction would emerge something new. Many German pilots who survived the Mustangs over Berlin would contribute to building the post-war Luftwaffe of democratic Germany, allied with the nation whose fighters had defeated their comrades. Johannes Steinhoff rose to become the chief of staff of the new German Air Force and eventually became the chairman of the NATO Military Committee. In 1983, he stood alongside American generals who had flown Mustangs against him, united in defending the freedoms that his former adversaries had brought to his defeated nation. This transformation from bitter enemies to loyal allies was perhaps the most profound shock of all. The Mustangs that appeared over Berlin had not only caused destruction, but they ultimately led to liberation. The German pilots, who were initially shocked by their arrival in 1944, would come to recognize that those American fighters had freed them from a criminal regime that had brought about their downfall. The final word belongs to Adolf Galland, the Luftwaffe's general of fighters, who had denied, witnessed, and ultimately survived the Mustang onslaught. In 1984, at a gathering of American and German fighter pilots in San Antonio, Texas, he raised his glass to his former adversaries. He said, "You surprised us when your Mustangs appeared over Berlin. You amazed us with your industry, your technology, and your determination. But the greatest surprise came after the war. You aided us in rebuilding. You shielded us from Soviet threats. You became our friends. The Mustangs over Berlin did more than end a war. They sparked a peace. For that, we who are still here will always be grateful." The circle was complete. The shock that began with Hans Kogler's terrified realization of American fighters over Brandenburg turned, through defeat and recovery, into partnership and friendship. The Mustangs transformed the sky forever, not just in Berlin on March 6, 1944. They altered the strategic environment in which all nations have functioned since. The true legacy of the P-51 Mustang lies in this transformation. It served not just as a tool of victory, but also as a catalyst for the post-war order. The shocked Luftwaffe pilots of March 1944 could never have foreseen that the American fighters dismantling their force would lead to their nation's redemption and integration into a community of democratic countries. Yet, that is precisely what occurred. The Mustangs that astonished the Luftwaffe over Berlin did not simply win a war. They helped secure a lasting peace that has endured for 8 decades. In the end, that may be their most significant triumph.